The morning mist clung to the Argonne forest like a shroud over the dead, and in many ways it was. Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall stood on a muddy hillock overlooking the vast expanse of trenches, barbed wire, and shell-scarred earth that would soon become America's proving ground in the Great War. It was September 25th, 1918, and the largest American military operation in history was less than 24 hours away. Marshall adjusted his field glasses, studying the German positions that snaked through the dense forest ahead. The enemy had spent 4 years turning this terrain into an impregnable fortress, complete with concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and enough barbed wire to fence half of Kansas. Behind him, over 1,200,000 American doughboys waited in their jumping-off positions, most of them barely old enough to shave, let alone face the horror that awaited them in the morning. General John Joseph Pershing had staked his reputation and America's military honor on this offensive. The Allied High Command had pressed him repeatedly to integrate American forces into existing British and French units. But Pershing had refused. The United States must fight as a unit, he had declared, and now that principle would be tested in the crucible of the Meuse-Argonne sector. The statistics were staggering even before the first shot was fired. First Army, under Pershing's direct command, faced 43 German divisions, entrenched across a front stretching 24 miles from the Meuse River to the edge of the Argonne forest. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans had turned every village, every hill, and every grove of trees into a death trap. The Hindenburg Line, the Germans called it, and it had never been broken. As referenced by the National Archives, this campaign would ultimately result in over 26,000 soldiers being killed in action Kia and over 120,000 total casualties, making it the deadliest military engagement in American history. But on this misty September evening, those numbers were still just projections on staff officers' maps. Major General Robert Lee Bullard paced among his 3rd Corps positions, checking on his division commanders one final time. The 79th Division, composed largely of drafted men from Pennsylvania and Maryland, occupied positions near Montfaucon. These weren't the hardened veterans of European armies who had been grinding each other down for 4 years. These were American boys who had been civilians just months before, hastily trained and shipped across the Atlantic to face an enemy that had perfected the art of defensive warfare. The plan seemed simple enough on paper. First Army would punch through the German lines in a coordinated assault, capturing the strategic railway hub at Sedan and cutting off German supply lines to the entire Western Front. 3 corps would advance simultaneously. The 1st Corps on the right flank near the Meuse, the 5th Corps in the center targeting Montfaucon, and the 3rd Corps on the left pushing into the Argonne forest proper. Artillery pieces stretched back as far as the eye could see, their crews making final adjustments to firing calculations that had been weeks in the making. Over 2,700 guns would participate in the opening barrage, the largest concentration of American firepower ever assembled. The sound, when it came, would be heard 50 miles away in Paris. Colonel William Mitchell's Air Service had assembled nearly 600 aircraft for the operation, an armada that would have been inconceivable just 4 years earlier. Fighter squadrons, observation planes, and bombers would support the ground assault, though many of the pilots were as green as the infantry they were meant to protect. As midnight approached, chaplains moved quietly through the forward positions, offering last rites and words of comfort to men who understood they might not see another sunrise. Letters home had been written, wills witnessed, and personal effects secured. The administrative machinery of death had processed over 1 million Americans, reducing each man to a serial number and a set of dog tags. The German positions remained ominously quiet as the American artillery crews prepared to commence their barrage. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, experienced German machine gunners checked their ammunition supplies and adjusted their sights. They had been here before, had survived the British offensive at the Somme, the French assault at Verdun, and countless smaller attacks that had been beaten back with horrific casualties. At exactly 2:30 in the morning on September 26, 1918, the earth erupted in fire and thunder.
How dare.
2,700 American artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, creating a barrage so intense that windows shattered in villages 20 miles behind the German lines. For 3 hours, high explosive shells, shrapnel rounds, and gas canisters fell on German positions in a mechanical rhythm of destruction that seemed to make the very ground pulse with each impact. Private James Morrison, of the 313th Infantry Regiment, pressed himself against the muddy wall of his jumping-off trench, yielding each artillery shell like a physical blow to his chest. The 79th Division had been assigned one of the most difficult objectives of the entire offensive, the capture of Montfaucon, a German observation post that dominated the entire sector. Morrison had enlisted in Baltimore just 8 months earlier, worked in a steel mill, and had never imagined anything like the industrial symphony of destruction unfolding around him. The German response was swift and professional. Counter-battery fire began falling on American positions within minutes. Guided by 4 years of precise range cards and pre-registered targets, German artillery officers had mapped every approach route, every assembly area, and every communication trench that the Americans might use. When their shells began falling among the massed American formations, the results were catastrophic. Captain Charles Whittlesey, of the 308th Infantry Regiment, huddled with his company commanders in a concrete bunker that had been captured from the Germans just days earlier. The 77th Division, known as the Metropolitan Division because most of its members came from New York City, was preparing to advance into the heart of the Argonne Forest. These urban draftees, many of whom had never seen a forest before their military service, would soon be fighting for their lives in some of the most difficult terrain on the Western Front. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, American artillery shifted to targets deeper behind German lines, and whistles began sounding along the 24-mile front. Over 300,000 American soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward the German positions through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Shell craters filled with stagnant water dotted the muddy ground, and the twisted remains of previous attacks lay scattered among the barbed wire obstacles. The initial advance progressed better than expected in some sectors. The 179th Division managed to capture several German outposts and advance nearly 2 miles before encountering serious resistance. The 4th Division, attacking on the right flank near the Meuse River, pushed forward against lighter opposition and captured several strategic hills. For a brief moment, it seemed as though American tactics and determination might overcome German defensive expertise. But the German army had not spent 4 years fortifying this sector, only to abandon it after a single barrage. As American forces pushed deeper into the German defensive system, they encountered the real strength of the Hindenburg Line. Machine gun nests that had survived the artillery barrage opened fire from concealed positions, cutting down advancing Americans with methodical precision. The terrain itself became an enemy. The Argonne Forest consisted of dense woods, broken by steep ravines, muddy creek beds, and rocky outcroppings that channeled American advances into pre-selected killing zones. German engineers had felled trees across potential approach routes, forcing American units to bunch up in areas covered by multiple machine gun positions. What had looked like a straightforward advance on staff maps became a nightmare of confusion and casualties in the actual forest. Communication broke down almost immediately. Telephone lines were cut by German artillery, radio equipment failed in the muddy conditions, and runner casualties mounted as German snipers picked off anyone moving between units. Division commanders lost contact with their regiments. Regimental commanders couldn't locate their battalions. Company officers found themselves leading scattered groups of men toward objectives they could no longer identify. The casualty reports that began filtering back to 1st Army headquarters painted a grim picture. The 79th Division, attacking Montfaucon, had suffered over 2,000 casualties in the first 6 hours of the assault. The 77th Division, pushing into the Argonne proper, reported entire companies missing or destroyed. Medical stations hastily established behind the lines were overwhelmed with wounded men who had been carried back through miles of muddy trenches and shell-torn ground, as referenced by War History Online. The high casualty rate was partly due to the fact that 70% of troops were young, between 18 to 23, and inexperienced. This, paired with poorly planned tactics, contributed significantly to the mounting losses. The reality of modern warfare was proving far more complex and deadly than American military planners had anticipated. By nightfall on September 26th, the 1st Army had advanced an average of 3 miles along most of the front, captured thousands of German prisoners, and seized numerous strategic positions. But the cost had been enormous, and the most difficult fighting still lay ahead. The ancient village of Montfaucon perched on its commanding hill like a medieval fortress, and in many ways that's exactly what it had become. German engineers had transformed every stone building, every cellar, and every shell crater into a defensive position. The village's strategic importance couldn't be overstated. From its heights, German observers could direct artillery fire across the entire American sector, making any significant advance impossible as long as it remained in enemy hands. Major General Joseph Kuhn's 17th Ninth Division had been tasked with capturing this Gibraltar of the Western Front, but their first assault on September 26th had been repulsed with heavy casualties. As dawn broke on September 27th, the survivors of that initial attack prepared to try again. Knowing that their success or failure might determine the outcome of the entire offensive, Lieutenant Robert Casey of the 313th Infantry Regiment crouched in a shell hole just 500 yards from the German positions on the hill. Around him lay the bodies of men from his platoon, who had fallen during the previous day's assault. German machine gunners had positioned themselves with mathematical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach to the village into a death trap. Casey could see the barrel of a German machine gun protruding from the ruins of what had once been the village church. The preparatory barrage began at dawn, but this time the German response was immediate and devastating. Counter-battery fire fell among the American artillery positions with deadly accuracy, silencing gun after gun. German observers on Montfaucon could see every American position, every supply dump, and every assembly area. They had spent 4 years cataloging targets, and their fire was precise and economical. Captain Thomas Johnson led his company of Maryland National Guardsmen up the slope through a maze of barbed wire and shell craters. These men had trained together for months, had crossed the Atlantic together, and now they were dying together on a hill in France whose name most of them couldn't pronounce. Johnson himself had been a high school principal in Baltimore before the war, and he found himself applying classroom management skills to keep his men organized under fire. The German defenders were members of the 5th Guard Division, elite troops who had fought on every major front of the war. They knew exactly when to open fire for maximum effect, when to fall back to secondary positions, and when to launch counterattacks that would disrupt American advances. These weren't the war-weary conscripts that American intelligence had predicted. These were professionals who understood their business. By 10 in the morning, 3 separate American assaults had been beaten back from the approaches to Montfaucon. The slopes of the hill were littered with American casualties, and medical corpsmen risked their lives repeatedly to drag wounded men back to aid stations. The German machine gunners had learned to let the medics work. Wounded men required more resources than dead ones, and screaming casualties had a devastating effect on the morale of attacking troops. Colonel Sweezy, commanding the 314th Infantry Regiment, made the decision that would ultimately capture Montfaucon. Instead of continuing frontal assaults up the main slopes, he ordered his battalions to infiltrate through the dense woods on either side of the village, accepting the risk of units becoming separated and confused in order to avoid the killing ground of the main approaches. The tactic worked, but at enormous cost. American infantry squads worked their way through the forest in small groups, often losing contact with their parent units for hours at a time. They encountered German positions that hadn't appeared on any map, fought desperate firefights in clearings that had no names, and sometimes found themselves behind German lines without knowing how they had gotten there. Private Morrison, who had survived the artillery barrage of the previous morning, found himself in a crater with 5 other men from his squad, pinned down by German machine gun fire from 2 different directions. They had no communication with their company, no clear idea of their location, and limited ammunition. The sound of fighting seemed to come from every direction, creating a 3-dimensional battlefield that bore no resemblance to the linear warfare they had trained for. The breakthrough came at 2 in the afternoon when elements of the 313th Infantry Regiment managed to fight their way into the village itself. Street fighting in Montfaucon became a matter of clearing each building individually, often with hand grenades and bayonets. German defenders fell back from position to position, making the Americans pay for every room, every cellar, and every pile of rubble. By evening, the American flag flew over Montfaucon, but the victory had cost the 79th Division over 4,000 casualties in 2 days of fighting. The strategic hill was in American hands, but the division was so badly mauled that it would require complete reorganization before it could continue the offensive. Medical stations behind the lines were overwhelmed with wounded men, and Graves registration units worked through the night to collect and identify the dead. The capture of Montfaucon was hailed as a great American victory, and in strategic terms, it was. But the cost in human terms was staggering, and it provided a grim preview of what the remainder of the offensive would demand from American forces. The dense forests of the Argonne had swallowed entire American units like a green maze designed by a malevolent god. Trees that had stood for centuries created a canopy so thick that even midday seemed like twilight. And the undergrowth was dense enough to hide entire German machine gun positions just yards from American patrols. Major Charles Whittlesey of the 308th Infantry, the regiment was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. It was October 2nd, 1918. And Whittlesey's battalion had been advancing through the forest for 6 days, following orders to maintain contact with French forces on their left flank and other American units on their right, but those units had fallen behind or been stopped by German resistance. And Whittlesey found himself with 550 men isolated deep in German territory with no clear way back to American lines. The terrain itself seemed designed to confuse and disorient attacking forces. Ravines that appeared on maps to be minor features turned out to be impassable gorges, filled with barbed wire and covered by German machine guns. Creek beds that looked like natural avenues of approach led directly into German strongpoints. The Germans had spent 4 years learning every tree, every rock, and every fold of ground in this sector. Sergeant Alexander Tillman of the 307th Infantry Regiment pressed his back against a massive oak tree and tried to determine his unit's position. His company had started the day with 87 men and was now down to perhaps 30, scattered across several hundred yards of forest with no communication between groups. German snipers seemed to be everywhere, and the distinctive crack of their rifles had become a constant background noise. The German defenders were members of Reserve Infantry Regiment 254, experienced troops who knew these woods like their own neighborhoods. They had prepared positions that were invisible until American soldiers were within grenade range, and they had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit American inexperience in forest fighting. Small German patrols would attack American flanks, then disappear into the undergrowth, before coordinated counterattacks could be organized. Whittlesey's men found themselves on a rocky hillside in a depression that offered some protection from German artillery, but was completely surrounded by enemy positions. They had advanced beyond their supporting artillery, had no communication with higher headquarters, and were rapidly running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The major faced a decision that would define his military career: retreat without orders or hold position and hope for relief. He chose to hold, and his men began what would become known as the ordeal of the Lost Battalion, although they were neither lost nor a full battalion.
Ow.
They knew approximately where they were, and they consisted of elements from several different units that had become mixed together during 6 days of confusing forest fighting. But the name would stick, and their story would become one of the most famous episodes of American involvement in the Great War. German forces quickly recognized that they had isolated a significant American unit and began concentrating forces for its destruction. Artillery fire began falling on the American position with increasing accuracy, guided by German observers, who could move freely through their own territory. Machine gun positions were established on the high ground surrounding the depression, creating a killing zone that made any movement by the Americans extremely dangerous. The first German attack came at dawn on October 3rd, preceded by a concentrated artillery barrage that shattered trees and filled the air with deadly splinters of wood and metal. German infantry advanced from 3 different directions simultaneously, forcing the Americans to defend a perimeter they didn't have enough men to properly cover. The fighting was desperate in close range, often coming down to bayonets and entrenching tools when ammunition ran low. Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Houghton, who had been separated from his own unit during the advance, found himself commanding a mixed group of men from 4 different companies. They had established defensive positions using fallen logs and shell craters, but their ammunition was critically low, and they had no way to evacuate their wounded. German prisoners later reported that they had been ordered to take no prisoners during their attacks on the isolated American forces. Medical supplies ran out on the 2nd day of the siege. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, who had volunteered to serve as a runner, despite having no military experience before the war, crawled through German positions under cover of darkness trying to reach American lines with requests for ammunition and medical support. His journey of several miles through enemy-controlled forest, guided only by sound and instinct, would become one of the war's most remarkable individual achievements. The Americans tried desperately to signal their location to friendly aircraft, but the dense forest canopy made visual identification almost impossible. Several supply drops intended for Whittlesey's men fell into German hands instead, providing the enemy with American rations, ammunition, and medical supplies. While the isolated troops continued to suffer, by October 4th the situation was becoming desperate. The Americans were down to 1 meal per day, medical cases were mounting without treatment, and German attacks were becoming more frequent and better coordinated. Yet the men held their positions, understanding that their sacrifice might be buying time for other American units to reorganize and continue the offensive. The sound of American artillery falling on their own positions was unmistakable, the distinctive whistle of incoming shells, followed by explosions that sent dirt and shrapnel flying through the trees where Major Whittlesey's men huddled in their improvised foxholes. It was October 4th, 1918, and one of the most tragic episodes of the Meuse-Argonne offensive was unfolding in the depths of the Argonne forest. American artillery officers, desperate to provide support for what they believed was an attack on German positions, had been firing into the area where the lost battalion was trapped. Without direct communication and without dated position reports, the gunners were unknowingly shelling their own men. The psychological effect on troops who had already endured 3 days of German attacks, starvation and mounting casualties was devastating. Private Omer Richards of the 308th Infantry Regiment crouched in a shell crater that had become the unit's aid station, helping Corporal Harold Lawson treat wounded men with supplies that had run out 2 days earlier. They were using strips torn from their own uniforms as bandages and had no morphine left to ease the suffering of the seriously wounded. The smell of gangrene was becoming noticeable among men whose wounds had become infected. The German commanders surrounding the trapped Americans were professional soldiers who understood the propaganda value of capturing or destroying an entire American unit intact. They brought up additional machine guns, positioned snipers to cover every possible escape route, and began systematic attacks designed to gradually reduce the American perimeter. These weren't wild charges, but carefully coordinated assaults that reflected years of experience in forest warfare. Lieutenant Thomas Poole, who had assumed command of what remained of his company after his captain was killed on October 2nd, made the decision to send another runner through German lines with an updated position report and a desperate plea for accurate artillery support. Private Charles Whittlesey, coincidentally sharing the same surname as his commander, volunteered for the mission despite having been wounded in the shoulder. During a German attack the previous day, the runner's journey through several miles of German-controlled forests became an epic of individual courage and determination, moving only at night, navigating by sound and instinct through terrain that looked identical in every direction, avoiding German patrols that were actively searching for exactly this type of American infiltration attempt. Private Whittlesey somehow managed to reach American lines and deliver his message. The relief effort that followed involved elements of 3 different American divisions and required careful coordination to avoid the friendly fire incidents that had already caused so many casualties. 77th Division's 142nd Infantry Regiment launched a series of attacks designed to draw German attention away from the trapped battalion, while engineers worked to clear approach routes through the dense forest. Captain Nelson Holderman, who had been commanding one of the companies trapped with Whittlesey, was severely wounded during a German attack on October 6th, but continued to direct his men's defensive efforts from a stretcher. His calm leadership under impossible circumstances helped maintain unit cohesion when many of the men were approaching the breaking point. The captain had been a lawyer in civilian life, and found himself applying negotiation skills to keep his men focused on survival rather than surrender. The breakthrough came on October 7th, when elements of the 77th Division's 207th Infantry Regiment finally fought their way through German positions and established contact with the survivors. Of the 550 men who had started the advance 6 days earlier, only 194 were still capable of walking out under their own power. The remainder were dead, wounded, or missing. Major Whittlesey, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the ordeal, emerged from the forest as a changed man. The weight of command decisions that had cost so many lives, combined with the physical and psychological stress of the siege, had taken a toll that would follow him for the rest of his life. The hero's welcome that awaited him in America would prove to be its own form of burden. The rescue of the lost battalion became front-page news across America, providing a dramatic human interest story that helped sustain public support for the war effort. But the tactical lessons were sobering. American forces had advanced too quickly through difficult terrain, had failed to maintain proper communication with supporting units, and had underestimated German defensive capabilities in forest warfare. The medical statistics from the siege were particularly revealing. Of the men evacuated as casualties, a significant percentage were suffering from what would later be recognized as symptoms of combat fatigue or shell shock. The psychological toll of modern warfare was becoming impossible to ignore, even though military medicine had few tools for dealing with such conditions. By mid-October 1918, the great American offensive that had begun with such promise 3 weeks earlier had ground to a bloody standstill. The First Army, which had advanced with confidence against German positions on September 26, now found itself locked in a war of attrition that resembled the worst aspects of the previous 4 years of Western front fighting. General Hunter Liggett, who had assumed command of the First Army from General Pershing on October 12, inherited a force that was exhausted, disorganized, and demoralized. Combat units that had started the offensive at full strength were now operating at 50% efficiency or less. The casualty replacement system was bringing in men who had received minimal training, often arriving at frontline units with less than 6 weeks of military experience. Colonel James Parker of the 42nd Infantry Division staff stood in what had once been a French farmhouse, now serving as a forward command post, studying intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of German defensive preparations. The enemy had used the American pause to bring up fresh divisions, improve their defensive positions, and coordinate their artillery to cover every possible American approach route. What had begun as a breakthrough operation was becoming a siege. The statistics were sobering. As referenced by Army Heritage Center Foundation research, American casualties were high over 117,000, but the results were impressive. The First Army had driven 43 German divisions, back about 30 miles over some of the most difficult terrain and most heavily fortified positions on the Western Front. However, the cost in human terms was becoming difficult to sustain, and American units were struggling to maintain their combat effectiveness. Private Daniel Murphy of the 16th Infantry Regiment sat in a muddy dugout that had been carved into the side of a hill, sharing a can of cold beans with 3 other soldiers from his squad. They had been in continuous combat for 22 days, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations when they could get them, and watching their friends die in numbers that seemed impossible to comprehend. Murphy had worked in a Detroit automobile factory before the war and found that the industrial process of warfare bore uncomfortable similarities to manufacturing, except that the products were casualties. The German defenders were showing remarkable resilience despite weeks of continuous pressure. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria had personally taken command of the defense of the sector, bringing with him some of the German army's most experienced units. The 5th Guard Division, the 47th Reserve Division, and elements of the 1st Guard Division were all committed to holding the American advance, and these were troops who had survived years of fighting against British and French forces. Supply problems were becoming critical for American forces. The narrow roads leading to the frontline positions were constantly under German artillery fire, making it dangerous to move supplies forward during daylight hours. Ammunition shortages forced American artillery to ration their fire support, while German guns seemed to have unlimited supplies of shells. Medical evacuation was particularly difficult, with wounded men sometimes waiting hours in exposed positions before ambulances could reach them. Lieutenant Harold Alexander of the 32nd Division's Medical Corps worked in an aid station that had been established in a partially collapsed church, treating casualties under conditions that would have been unthinkable in civilian medical practice. The smell of disinfectant mixed with cordite and human waste created an atmosphere that stayed with medical personnel long after they left the front lines. Alexander had completed his medical training just months before being drafted, and found that nothing in medical school had prepared him for wounds caused by high explosive shells and machine gun bullets. The psychological toll on American forces was becoming impossible to ignore. Cases of what was then called shell shock were mounting rapidly, and military police were dealing with increasing numbers of soldiers who had simply walked away from their units. The term straggler entered military vocabulary to describe men who weren't technically deserters but had become separated from their units and seemed unable or unwilling to return to combat. German defensive tactics had evolved to exploit American weaknesses. Machine gun teams would allow American patrols to advance deep into their positions before opening fire, cutting off retreat routes and forcing desperate small unit actions that exhausted American reserves. Artillery fire was coordinated to fall on American assembly areas just as attacks were beginning, causing maximum disruption and casualties among units that were already weakened by previous fighting. The weather was becoming a factor as well. October rains had turned the battlefield into a sea of mud that made movement difficult and added to the misery of men living in improvised shelters. Trench foot was becoming a significant medical problem, and respiratory illnesses were spreading through units that were crowded together in unsanitary conditions. General Liggett made the difficult decision to pause major offensive operations, while his staff worked to reorganize the First Army's battered divisions. Fresh units were brought up from the rear. XPERIENCED officers were transferred to replace casualties among the leadership, and extensive retraining programs were established for units that had been shot to pieces during the first phase of the offensive. The pause was necessary from a military standpoint, but it came at a psychological cost. American soldiers who had been told they were winning the war found themselves holding the same positions day after day, taking casualties from German artillery and sniper fire without advancing toward any visible objective. Morale problems that had been manageable during active offensive operations became serious disciplinary issues during the static warfare of mid-October. The morning of November 1st, 1918, brought with it a crisp autumn chill and the largest American artillery barrage since the offensive had begun 5 weeks earlier. General Hunter Liggett had used the October pause to completely reorganize the First Army, bringing up fresh divisions, redistributing experienced officers, and developing new tactics based on the hard lessons learned during the bloody fighting of September and October. Colonel George Marshall, now serving as Liggett's chief of operations, had worked tirelessly to coordinate what would become the final phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The plan was ambitious but realistic. Instead of the broad frontal assaults that had characterized earlier phases of the operation, American forces would concentrate on specific objectives using combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, artillery, and air support more effectively than ever before. The 2nd Division, which had been held in reserve during the previous month's fighting, was assigned to capture the strategic heights near Barricourt. These were veteran troops who had fought at Below Wood and St. Mihiel, and their professionalism was immediately apparent to the German defenders who faced them. Unlike the enthusiastic but inexperienced divisions that had begun the offensive in September, these men understood the deadly mathematics of modern warfare. Private George Hamilton of the 5th Marine Regiment advanced through the morning mist with the steady pace of a professional soldier. Round him, his squad moved with the coordinated precision that came from months of combat experience. They had learned to read the terrain, to identify potential German positions before they became visible, and to use supporting fire effectively rather than relying solely on individual courage and determination. The German defense was showing signs of strain after weeks of continuous combat. Many of the elite units that had initially opposed the American advance had been worn down by constant fighting, and replacement troops were often older men or boys who lacked the experience of the original defenders. German artillery, which had been so effective during the early phases of the battle, was beginning to suffer from ammunition shortages and counter-battery fire from increasingly accurate American guns. Captain Robert Donovan, of the 42nd Division's artillery, found that his battery was finally receiving the kind of fire, support coordination that should have been available from the beginning of the offensive. Forward observers were better trained, communication systems were more reliable, and the integration between infantry and artillery had improved dramatically. American guns could now respond to calls for fire support within minutes rather than hours. The breakthrough came on November 4th, when elements of the 1st Division captured the village of Busancy, opening a gap in the German line that could be exploited by mobile American forces. The success was the result of careful planning, adequate preparation, and the kind of tactical coordination that had been lacking during the desperate fighting of September and October. German resistance began to collapse in sections rather than along the entire front. Units that had held their positions tenaciously for weeks suddenly found themselves outflanked and surrounded as American forces exploited gaps in the defensive line. The German army's legendary discipline began to show cracks as entire regiments surrendered rather than fight to the last man. Lieutenant John Morrison of the 82nd Division, brother to Private James Morrison, who had been killed during the assault on Montfaucon, led his platoon through the village of Stenay on November 10th, encountering German soldiers who seemed more interested in surrender than resistance. The contrast with the desperate fighting of previous weeks was remarkable and provided the first real indication that German military effectiveness was finally beginning to break down. The final day of fighting, November 11th, began with American forces advancing rapidly against token German resistance. The armistice that would end the war was scheduled to take effect at 11 in the morning, but military operations continued until the last minute. The final American casualty of the Meuse-Argonne offensive was Private Henry Gunther of the 313th Infantry Regiment, killed at 10:59, just 1 minute before the war officially ended. The statistics of the Meuse-Argonne offensive were staggering in their scope and cost. Over 1,200,000 American soldiers had participated in the 47-day operation, making it the largest military operation in American history. The human cost had been enormous: 26,277 Americans killed and 95,786 wounded, representing casualty rates that approached those of the bloodiest Civil War battles. But the strategic results had justified the sacrifice. The First Army had broken through the most heavily fortified defensive positions on the Western Front, driven 43 German divisions back 30 miles, and had captured the railway hub at Sedan that was crucial to German logistics. More importantly, the operation had demonstrated that American forces could fight as an independent army and achieve decisive results against experienced European opponents. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had transformed the American expeditionary forces from an eager but inexperienced army into a professional military organization capable of conducting complex operations under the most difficult conditions. The lessons learned in the forests of the Argonne and on the hills around Montfaucon would influence American military doctrine for generations to come. As American soldiers began the long journey home in the weeks following the armistice, they carried with them memories of courage, sacrifice, and achievement that would define America's role in the world for the remainder of the 20th century. The price had been paid in blood, but America had proven itself capable of decisive action on the world stage. The Great War was over, and America had emerged as a global power forged in the crucible of the Meuse-Argonne.